tonight. I have not published this poem yet. I've been writing it for a couple weeks, from I think mid-March to the first week of April. It is a longer poem. I've been working on this manuscript of long poems and couplets that I think of as essays in verse. I want to say hi to my agent, Rob Arnold, who's here, who knows all about this, because after I wrote this poem, I sent it to him and said, the book is longer now, Rob, so sell this. I also want to say hi to my mom, who's joining us. I see Mi-Young Koo is here. It's very exciting. This is like the third reading she's ever attended by me, this one virtually. I also just want to say hi to my friend Kieran Bath, all the way in Australia. It's cool that you can join us. Anyone else from, well, I'm not going to ask because I shouldn't speak yet, but hopefully there's some other guests from around the world. I'm going to read this poem, and what I'm going to do now is going to share my screen. They've also posted a link in the chat in case, for whatever reason, your Wi-Fi is bad and you can't follow my scrolling. Can everyone see the screen? You can just nod your heads. Okay, great. Just a couple words of context before I begin. The poem takes its title after a phrase in a very famous poem by William Butler Yeats called Dialogue of Self and Soul. You will see the phrase come in at the end of the poem as well, so I've sort of given away what's going to happen at the end. But as I was working through what was happening with the pandemic, it just, as I'm sure it struck all of you, it just struck me as a very strange event, because you could only, unless you were in a hospital, unless you were working on the front lines or directly involved and still going out in the world, you were basically, you know, ordered to stay in, and also the responsible thing to do was to stay in. So the only way you could really follow or experience what was happening was digitally, or by reading the news. So, and you know, when you would actually go outside, everything would kind of just look the same. It just looked like no one was around. So it made the experience of the pandemic, especially in the first couple of weeks, very strange. And it got me thinking a lot about community and knowledge, because one of the biggest problems with the pandemic was a lack of knowledge. That problem continues, and I certainly was not exempt from that problem, because I remember in the early stages of the pandemic just assuring everyone was going to be okay, and then very quickly realizing just how idiotic that was. So that's about all I'll say about it, and I'm just going to get into it. And if you have any questions, you can ask me later. Everything we look upon is blessed. By the time we're aware of it, fully aware, that is, it's already too late, showing fully to be a fiction. Not just fully, but awareness itself, there being no difference between aware and fully aware, everything hopelessly partial, or hopefully partial. Hope seeming to be what gets in the way of understanding just how dire the situation is. Oh, this problem will go away. It's not that bad. There's no need to be paranoid. Look at all these idiots panicking on social media. They're creating an alternate reality. Or so I said as I traveled to attend the writing conference in another state, declaring it's not like the NBA is canceling its games or schools are closing down. Think of how many more tens of thousands of people are gathering for those things every day. Then 2 days after I got back, the NBA canceled its games and schools started closing down, including my own. Who's the idiot now, you idiot? But I didn't think that, still don't think it, not really. Even as I know I used to mock people who thought this was anything more serious than the seasonal flu, something I picked up from my new doctor, a Chinese guy in Chinatown who said he loved what the coronavirus had done for him on the subway and at restaurants. Now he just had to cough to clear out a whole section of a train during rush hour. He no longer had to wait to get seated at the most trendy Chinese restaurants. The authority of his mockery of white American paranoia passed on to me my own mockery. I saw the panic as another manifestation of racism. Still see it that way, on some level. Even as I wash my hands 20 times a day and mutter idiot under my breath at anyone who walks within 6 feet of me the few times I go out anymore, seething anytime the president turns corona into Chinese and infects idiots out there to yell at me to go home. But this doesn't bother me, not really, or not fully. This kind of racism feels minor compared to the specter of hospitals barely breathable with bodies, mostly brown and black, unable to keep up with the onslaught of infection, Or Vanda Piccioli, director of one of the last funeral homes remaining open in Bergamo, Italy, saying, "We take the dead from the morning till night, one after the other, constantly," characterizing her job, "You are a sponge and you take the pain of everybody," which cut right through the nonsense or sense, helping me imagine the scale of what's happening, but not fully, not even close, not really. And that because what's happening is still for me, sadly, happily, a matter of the imagination. I haven't seen the hospitals or funeral homes, haven't seen anyone sick with the virus, don't even know anyone yet who has it. Only know what I see in a screen, which changes constantly. You shouldn't wear a mask, you should wear a mask. You shouldn't wear a mask, you should wear a mask. The director of the CDC comically, tragically, saying guidance on the use of masks is being critically re-reviewed. One doctor saying in the early going how you were more likely to be killed by lightning than the virus. What an idiot, you idiot. But was he actually wrong or just not fully right? How do we know? I've seen more lightning bolts than people dying from the virus, the only real evidence I have drawn from the world's withdrawal. Stores and restaurants shuttered in my neighborhood, gym padlocked one night after I'd worked out there with 9 people, then 5, then 1 the 3 nights before, forcing me onto the track across the street where joggers swerved away from each other across the lanes. Or, most eerily, the BQE over the Kosciuszko Bridge entirely free of traffic during rush hour. A freedom I've never felt there before, making me almost giddy. Was that fear you felt? No, not really. Just a strange difference, a fascination at absence. If this is the apocalypse, I thought, it's not how you imagined it. But did you imagine it? Didn't you rather have it imagined for you by the makers of spectacular fictions, who filled your mind with images of a world gone animal again, elemental, everyone smeared with their own shit, stumbling around in fetid caverns such as the gutters in hell full of condemned souls must be, relieving themselves wherever they like because what does it matter? They're all blind. They can only see white. Or a man tearing open the throat of another man with his teeth to break free of a headlock as another man threatens to rape his son in front of him. Or a husband abandoning his wife to save himself as they're cornered by the flesh-eating infected, then later finding to his surprise and shame that she hasn't turned when they're reunited by chance in a safe zone, begging for her forgiveness, saying he was just terrified, kissing her to make up and discovering too late that she has been infected, but is just immune, instantly turning on her and gorging himself on her face as if in a vengeful rage, as if he blames her for tricking him like this when he thought he'd escaped by caring only for himself. This is the pandemic we deserve, isn't it? The one that seems to happen by not happening. The asymptomatic infected thinking it's happening someplace else and carrying on as usual, spreading the infection. The most powerful visual toll, not the bodies of the dead, not the caregivers buried in protective gear, which barely dent our Netflixed imaginations, but the great empty, as the New York Times called it in a special Sunday section on March 29th. All the places in the world emptied of their publics captured in full-page color photographs. The Place de la Concorde in Paris, the Spanish Steps in Rome, Times Square in New York, and this toll you can't see except when gathered in a gallery. Otherwise, you're in just one place at one time and likely not in one of these. And the photos are beautiful, not terrifying, distilling the aesthetics of social distancing, giving idiots, you idiot, incentive to venture out into the great empty to Instagram it. Imagine this pitched as apocalyptic cinema. Perhaps Antonioni could do it, but only for a few minutes. What a flop. We'd sit there wondering when something was going to happen. Is this all there is? Where are the zombies, the savage acts? Where are the cities razed to rubble? Where are the people? Oh, there, sitting at home, mostly white, bored, staring at screens, frustrated they can't find any more sanitizing wipes or toilet paper online, annoyed that packages are taking more than 2 days to arrive, doing more cooking and cleaning than usual, drinking more than usual, spending less money, worrying more about money, waiting for checks to arrive, applying for grants and loans, finally spending more time with the fam, making more of an effort to reach out to friends and ask them, actually kind of ask them how they're doing. And not just by sending a text, but calling, doing more reading, finally attempting War and Peace, or not, making use of all the mindfulness apps they didn't have time for before. Is this the way the world ends? Not with a bang or a whimper, but more time at home? More time for self-care? It's a strange spectacle, this non-spectacle. Instead of something alien to see, we're given ourselves, magnified in all our mundanity, lack of knowledge and imagination, and inequality. Even those on the front lines of this, the doctors and nurses and EMTs, can't see what they're fighting, can't even really be said to be fighting, as they don't know enough about the virus to treat it, only how to try to make those suffering a little more comfortable. What's most frightening is what's not there. The threat of infection, the ventilators and masks running out, the beds running out, the space, the millions of jobs liquidated, cash and investments depleted, the virus most visible in how it's devouring our infrastructure, while the only thing we can do, apparently, to stop it, according to what we know, but what do we know? Or if not stop it, slow it down, is to be not there, to stay away from each other, stay away from places of business, which seems like a curious way to slow down, let alone stop the collapse of the global economy. Absurdly, those of us more privileged sitting at home could be said to be more on the front lines than those actually putting their lives on the line, because it's up to us to stop the spread of infection by not doing anything. And what civic action is this? Not doing as the new doing, not being there as the new being there, online as the front line? Does this sound familiar? Isn't social distancing the dystopian dream of social media? Living in a world where going online to engage with it is the healthiest, most responsible way to be, where there's no judgment about screen time or shaming about addiction to virtual reality, because this is the new reality. The tweeting moral mobs and instant influencers have won. This is the reality we deserve, isn't it? Where we learn just how joyless is the world without the world. Damn, Karen Chi tweets, I am in New York and I miss New York so bad. Just how empty the community without bodies together in a room. Just how socially distanced we already are. And how far gone we are, how we can only bring ourselves back by withdrawing even further into this reality where your zip code is often a determinant of your health outcome. As Mandy Cohen of the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services says, shedding en masse more black and brown and poor and old and sick and disabled bodies, doubling down on our segregation is a state-sanctioned matter of public health. There can't be any talk of togetherness as a way out of this, can there? Except by idiots, you idiot, who think we're all in this together because the virus doesn't discriminate between young and old, rich and poor, white and black. See, Tom Hanks got sick, Bourne Johnson's in intensive care, Fountains of Wayne dude died. Sure, you idiot, but we discriminate. For every Tom Hanks who doesn't die, there are thousands who do because they lack access to health care or live in cramped quarters with 2 or 3 generations of their family, or they're old and already sick with something else, so the ventilator they need gets passed to a younger person. I can't even believe I have to write this down. I was going to say it makes me sick, but of course it doesn't. I get to sit here and think about how privilege even gets revealed in figures of speech, who uses them and how. I don't have to write this down. I get to write this down. Of course I get to write this down. Of course I can believe it. I go to sleep every night believing I'll wake up the next morning, body and mind functioning, blessed with the right, the opportunity to write, blessed with even more time now to do so as I no longer have to commute to work in Connecticut 3 days a week. One of the silver linings, you idiot, of the pandemic, as I've been saying to friends, blessed to be able to enjoy silver linings instead of redlining, blessed to have a job that can be moved online without much trouble, blessed, you idiot, by the many ways teaching is easier because my students are both more relaxed and more focused on Zoom without the distraction and anxieties they have to deal with in the classroom. They can just chill in their beds. No one starts to pack up 5 minutes before the end of class anymore or checks the clock. Or maybe I just don't notice or care as I'm looking at a screen with little thumbnails of their faces and don't read anything into their bored expressions as I would in the classroom, can't read their body language. More silver linings, you Bradley Cooper. Blessed to be running a business whose operations are run online, not in a building with a lease or mortgage, whose main source of revenue, poetry workshops, can be moved online and draw even more interest now that so many people are forced to stay at home, whose events, if canceled, mean money saved, not lost, whose staff is small, part-time, and can still be paid to do their work online. Who knew it was such a blessing to be small? Blessed to be me, Blessed to be me. How lucky for you, you fancy fuckface. This is just how things have worked out so far. Things could have turned out very differently. My ambitions have always been to grow much bigger, to build my company, to have a physical presence, to build my staff, to build beyond a life of teaching poetry. Already my wife and I are looking to buy a second home upstate, to start a family. Imagine if we'd just done that and the person renting our one bedroom in Williamsburg was suddenly unable to pay rent, making it impossible for us to cover both mortgages. Yeah, just imagine, you idiot. We'd still be okay. It wouldn't be impossible. Both of our families have money. We'd figure it out. We'd get to figure it out. What a horror not to be able to pay both mortgages. I can't even believe I'm writing this down, you idiot. It doesn't make me sick. What a failure of the imagination has gotten us here. We can't see what we're fighting because we couldn't imagine being in this situation where we already were. Blessed to be us. Blessed to be us. Now just waiting it out. Unable to imagine anything but ourselves. Blessed by everything, as the famous poet once said. Everything we look upon is blessed. That's all. Stop my screen.
Thanks so much for sharing this great piece. There's so many moments we can talk about. First, to quickly introduce myself, I'm Alice. I'm a senior at Yale, and I also work on the ACC's alumni engagement team. Maybe we can start talking about your poem near the end when you write, "I can't believe I have to write this down. I was going to say it makes me sick, but of course it doesn't. I get to sit here and think about how privilege even gets revealed in figures of speech." Can you just give us a little bit of background on when you started writing poetry and elaborate on poetry as privilege in this specific moment?
That's a complicated question. The first part of the question was, when did I start writing poetry? Is that what it was?
Yeah.
Or how I got into it? I didn't start writing poetry until late in high school, and probably not really seriously until college. I would say my sophomore year of college. It is an interesting question to attach it to the question of privilege, because I think that it's something that probably all poets understand implicitly, is that there is always some privilege involved if you are able to write poetry, even if it's just the privilege of time and space enough to write it. And that time, it might just be like a 10-minute pocket of time, like during a war, and you're writing the poem on the back of a napkin or something. But even that is a privilege, because if your life is really in jeopardy, you're not going to be writing that poem. So what makes this experience of the pandemic pretty strange is that, you know, as a writer, you want to write things down. In fact, this poem started not as a poem that I was thinking of, I'm going to write a poem now. It's just me just trying to record some thoughts about what's going on. At first, I wasn't able to process anything because I was just in shock like everyone. And then about 2 or 3 weeks in, it occurred to me that I better start writing some stuff down. And the thing that was really bugging me was this idea of not knowing, and how this was accentuated during the pandemic, but it's just a human problem that exists all the time. And this is one of the things that I was already writing about in my poems, is, you know, for my whole life, really. But I think once I started that poem, you know, it started as a kind of public poem or a public address, but I knew think the whole way that it was going to sort of climax or trend toward this self-lashing at the end, because it's hard. It is a weird thing. Like you want to write this thing to render what you think is the truth, because you think that helps, right? The truth helps, but at the same time, you feel a guilt because, you know, what are you doing? You're not really doing anything physically to help anyone, at least. I mean, you can donate some money, you can try to help as much as you can, but the fact is you're not in the hospitals, right? Or you're not in the funeral homes, or you're not in the ambulances going out. So I think there's always been that tension in poetry, whether it's during a pandemic or a war or what have you. You know, whoever is writing a poem, even if it's a poem fraught with trauma and devastation, the fact is the writer had the privilege of time and space to write down and witness that thing. So it's always an interesting tension to me that exists in poetry. Doesn't make you feel any better about it, though.
I think
Other
then,
questions?
yeah, I think the next question we wanted to ask, it's again like a heavy duty, like two-pronged question. So come at it however you please. So it's more a question of practice. So like, as you describe a lot in the poem, we are like inside, and the way that we relate to space has changed a lot. And I'm wondering how sheltering in place has like impacted your practice as a writer, but also wondering about how specifically the like anti-Asian racism that's occurring in New York City, which has like seen a huge spike, is informing the way that you like write right now.
Okay, another two-part question, I think. The first part of it, I think the question was how has the shelter in place impacted my writing practice? Is that what you said? I would say it hasn't impacted it at all. In fact, I mean, again, one of the silver, quote unquote, silver linings that just start to disgust me by the end of that poem, and it's a phrase I almost can't even say anymore, but I think pretty much every writer I knew, in some ways, at least guiltily, even if they weren't admitting it, was kind of enjoying the self-quarantine or the sheltering in place because it just forced you to sit at home. Pretty soon I got into, I mean, I'm somebody that likes to read and write in the morning. So, and even before the pandemic, unless I was doing a Brooklyn Poets event or meeting friends or something, I just spend a lot of days at home. I'd work all day. I'll get up at 7 or 8 in the morning and just work until it's like 7 p.m. So I'm like, okay, now it's cocktail hour. But when the pandemic came to New York City and the shelter in place order came down, it was just like, well, now you really don't have any excuses. They're just, even if you want to go out or do something else, you can't. So that in some ways was actually a good thing because it sort of pressurized me in some ways to start writing. And I would say like also not having to teach in person. So I commute to Connecticut to teach at Quinnipiac University. In the spring, I do that 3 times a week. So when I started teaching online, I suddenly didn't have to do that anymore. So usually at this point in the semester, like March and April, I'm not working on poems anymore because I don't have time to do that. I usually write poems during my breaks, like winter break, summer break, spring break. And once it's like, or maybe the beginning of the semester, but once it's like March or April or like deep in the semester, there's just, it's pretty much nothing, none of that is going to happen. So it actually opened up this pocket of time where I was able to start working on this poem. The other question was about racism, yes, directed at Asians and Asian Americans. What was the question about that? Like, what do I think about that? Or how did that inform my writing?
Yeah, I guess how that's informing your writing, but also like the way that, I think this goes back to the practice issue, right? Like, how does that inform the responsibility or the way in which you write?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously what's happening is disgusting and just idiotic. But I think for me, it's not something that has infuriated me emotionally. I would say it infuriates me intellectually or conceptually. Conceptually sounds weird, but in a sort of detached way, I'm infuriated by it. Like when I read about it or I see a friend of mine who's Asian or Asian American post something on Facebook, it makes me mad, but in a kind of detached way. And I think that's because for me specifically, I remember, as I talked about in the beginning of the poem, like just laughing about the coronavirus with my new Chinese doctor. I think this was back in January, and he was just convinced this whole thing was just being completely overblown. And there was a different kind of conversation that we were having about racism, which was not that like, you know, people were telling us to go home or anything, but that like, oh, like all these white Americans are sort of paranoid about anything coming out of China. Um, so I think, you know, and that ended up informing my own sort of disinformation or lack of awareness about the real threat of this virus. So I think anytime I think about racism and race in general, I'm always thinking about my own complicity because there are many things that go into racism, not just race, but class enters into it, gender and sexuality always enter into it. So it's never as simple as like, oh, these people out there are just racist assholes who are telling me to go home. I mean, yeah, that's kind of true, but it's also something like I feel like the racism I'm more infuriated by or that I find more pernicious is much less obvious than that. So like that's the pretty like obvious racism that I kind of just brush off now. The stuff that's more insidious is behind the scenes that you can't even really notice. Stuff that happens systematically, stuff that happens in institutions. And we could talk all day about that. So I don't know if you want to ask me more questions about that, or yeah, I'll just leave it at that for now.
I think we're gonna open up to Q&A now because it's a little bit after 7:30. So if people want to ask any questions of Jason Koo, if they could start by introducing themselves, say their name, pronouns, maybe where they're from, that would be great. And again, to like indicate that you want to talk, just raise your hand in the participant section. Yeah, I can see that you raise your hand, so you can just unmute yourself, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to say that I really enjoyed the poem. Jason, you're a fantastic poet.
Thank you.
I love the part where you mention how lucky we are and how blessed we are, because this is something that's been in my mind, and that I've been thinking I need to write something about this, because thanks to the pandemic, I was able to rent a beautiful beach home in Fire Island, and I'm thinking about it like I'm able to have an apartment and a beach house, while some people cannot even afford their rent, and some people lost the job, they're struggling to eat, and I'm like, one part of me feels like just giving money away and not be enjoying this moment, because I can never rent a freaking beach house in Fire Island again, because they would cost me more money than I could ever afford. Now I can take it for half price. Should I deprive myself of that and just give the money away? Would that make me feel better? Or should I just be this greedy person that I'm being? I feel greedy, not greedy, but I feel like I'm being selfish, you know? So I really enjoy that, to really put that out there, because it's kind of like, it's things that I think I'm not the only one, surely, that is thinking about that. I'm sure other people are thinking about how blessed they are. If you have a job, like right now, I can write more than ever, you know, and I have a job that's paying for me to have 2 homes. It's like, it's such a blessing, you know, and to think that I can save money because I'm not spending money going to the bars and stuff, you know, like, and like, I'm thinking about, and all these people who don't have anything, you know, and it's, for some of us, I feel like for the rich, they may be very pissed off. For the poor, they are suffering. And for the medium class, which I would say us, we are in good shape, and we are actually benefiting because we can save money and we can do things that we couldn't do otherwise. So I think I really appreciate you viewing from that point, you know, and sharing it, because it's been in my mind and I haven't thought about, you know, like how I'm gonna put this into words, and now it inspired me to like write about the situation, because it's really nice.
All right. Well, that's good to hear. I would just say about the blessedness. I do mean it ironically. I mean, there's some, obviously there's a genuine appreciation of being blessed, but that's certainly by the end of the poem, it's a pretty sardonic, very maliciously self-directed irony about how blessed I am and how blessed we all are. And even I think, I was wondering what to title it as I was writing it. And then, I started repeating this blessed mantra at the end, and the line from Yeats occurred to me as a possible title for the poem. And I think one of the ways that I like the way the title works at the beginning is, I refer to the pandemic as it in the beginning, and it's not immediately clear, what it is, unless you're, in this thing, maybe you just assume that. But I think something that, I was seeing a lot of when the pandemic first really, became a big thing was just all the social media posts, especially on Instagram, on how blessed we all were for all the little things. And yeah, I hear all that, and, and I kind of agree, and I see that in my own life, but there's definitely a way in which there's a kind of industrial complex for mindfulness as well, and self-care, and those things can be pernicious too. And in some ways, becoming sort of gratefully aware of how blessed you are can be problematic, and can hide the real truth of what's happening, right? Because I think we are really in danger right now as a society. The segregation is just getting worse. So every time I see people talk about how it's bringing us all together, I just want to vomit in my mouth, because
No.
yes, like we can hope that's true, but if all you're doing is thinking about how blessed we all are and how blessed we are to have these little things in our life that we're grateful for, you're not going to be seeing it. I'm
And
not
being
saying we all
blessed in
have to be depressed and tragic, but we do have to see the whole picture.
Yeah,
being blessed in a way is actually a curse, you know, like I am not at peace knowing that others are not even having something to eat, you know? So how much of a bless it is, you know? And this is something that's been in my mind all my life, you know, as because I know what it is to come from nothing. I started picking up cans on the street to feed my brothers. So today I have more than I ever thought I was gonna have, you know? So it's in a way, it's like, why me? And not me being where I started. You know, it's kind of like it's always I have always this thing going in my mind, like why am I here doing what I'm doing and being blessed and not maybe am I really blessed?
Right.
yeah.
Well said.
I think we have another question someone dropped in the chat from Kieran, which is, do you feel the pressure of this tendency of our society to turn to poets and the arts for hope and production in this time? And how do you respond to that pressure or vibe?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like Karen's a poet too. I'm wondering if you're asking that question of yourself. I wouldn't say I feel a pressure as a poet, because I mean, society doesn't care about poets. So if they're going to start demanding poems now, it's like, where were you before when there was no crisis? You didn't seem to, be demanding my poems then. But I would say there's more of I guess feel an internal pressure. I wouldn't really call it a pressure, but just a compulsion. I mean, that to me is true of any time I feel the need to write a poem. So, I mean, when something like this is happening, maybe you feel that compulsion a little bit stronger. But I would say anytime I feel the need enough to write a poem, like, why am I writing a poem? It's because there's some kind of inner compulsion that is pushing me to create something, or to push whatever is in me into language and articulate that. I would say what's interesting about the time now is that, at least, speak for myself personally, but I feel like this is true for a lot of poets today. Like, I remember the days after 9/11 when I was 20, how old was I? I think I was like 25, thinking like, I can't write about this. There's no way I could write about this. And I wasn't sure I would ever write again for a little while. It just seemed like it completely made trivial everything that I was writing. And I think part of that was just youth. I mean, I wasn't really formed as a poet yet. I wasn't really formed as a person. Certainly wasn't grappling with things in my work that would have, I guess, prepared me to be able to feel like I could speak confidently about a seismic event like that. But I also feel like American poetry back then specifically wasn't prepared for it. That was a time, and it was only 19 years ago, where it was still considered, I would say, not gross, but like not okay to write about politics in a poem. And I would say today it's almost the opposite is true. Like, if you write a poem that doesn't have any kind of political resonance, people are almost like, why should I read this poem about trees or something, or about your grandmother, and there's no political inflection. So, I feel like as a poetry culture, at least in America now, this is probably true all around the world, there's definitely much more of a readiness for people to speak on this. Not that everyone's going to have, I think, really insightful things to say, but I think there's a general readiness, and I certainly felt that in myself. And now, of course, I'm much, much older, but I felt, I guess, in some ways good about that I felt like I was capable of speaking about it. So, Yeah, hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I think that really echoed, and it's kind of describing the weird tensions that happen, because I think in one sense, we're operating in this capitalist kind of framework, and there's a lot of tension around supporting the arts, yet at times like this, they kind of come to the artists and ask for reprieve and relief. And I think the difficulty is, what if you don't want to talk about relief or feel relief? What if you, or even kind of, contribute to like a rise in hope? I think that's the pressure that gets a bit uncomfortable and frankly inappropriate, and just kind of, you lose your artistic license in a way, in that sense.
Right. Yeah, I think I understand a little bit more what you're driving at now. That reminds me of that. What was that? Just disgusting celebrity special. What is that called? Like the Everyone Together thing, where the musicians were like Eddie Vedder was on there, and I mean he I actually liked. But do you know what I'm talking about? The thing that Coldplay dude does. It's like this big nonprofit, and they had this public streaming, and it's just, and the thing about it is I mean, I love a lot of those musicians that were performing. Like, yes, I understand that, like, they're trying to, I guess, bring hope and consolation to people, but you can't, as a society, be turning to, I think, poets especially, and just asking for messages of hope and consolation, because that, at least for me personally, that's not really going to do it. I want someone to tell me what's actually happening, because I find the truth hopeful and the truth consoling. So if you're just telling me, we're all in this together, we're going to come out of this a better society, we're going to be a better American, I'm just going to be rolling my eyes, because I hope that's true, but I don't really see the signs of that, especially with the current president in office. So I hope all of you poets that are listening to this, don't do the Coldplay thing. Sing about how everything is yellow, so that, ironically, Asian American Cultural Center, don't sing about how everything is yellow, and that's going to be this message of hope and consolation to the world. You all remember that song? That terrible song that I kind of liked when I was young.
Yeah, I guess two things. I sort of also reminds me of this moment in Kathy Brown Pong's Minor Feelings, where she's like on this like tour reading poems, and this white woman approaches her and is like, oh, and it's like after the 2016 election, and she's like, oh, you should be reading poems that help us heal. And she says, I'm not ready to heal. So similar thing.
Right. I remember that. It's a great book.
It's a great book. Yeah. I think Grace also had a question. So Grace, if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, you're welcome to do that. I think she may have left, actually.
Yeah, I see her, but I don't see her face or her mic. I see the question in the chat. Should I just answer the question?
Yeah, you're welcome to do that. So I think she was asking about like the tension between race, like privilege in terms of like a class perspective versus like how you position yourself in terms of like racial hierarchy, and how you relate to racial power within the realm of your like Asian American identity.
Yeah, I saw that question earlier in the chat. It's a really complicated question. I think about this all the time. I don't know if you can separate those things. I certainly don't think I can, like separating class privilege from racial privilege. Something I've been writing a lot about in the poems I've been working on, which shows up a little bit in this poem that I just read, is this peculiar special position that I see special kind of ironically, that Asian American citizens especially enjoy in the so-called racial hierarchy, as you posed it. There's definitely ways in which I feel myself much more aligned with whiteness than other POC, especially Black and Brown POC. So that makes things incredibly complicated. And so anytime I write about race, I feel like inevitably I am writing about privilege, because, and you brought up Kathy Park Hong's book, which is great. If you haven't read it, all of you should definitely read it. It kind of got, the promotion kind of got killed a little bit by the pandemic, but it's called Minor Feelings. And she talks about this. And one of the things she talks about or explores in this idea of minor feelings is, and this is something that really resonated with me, is like, you think your problems are not as important as the problems of African Americans, Latino Americans. So maybe you don't want to say anything, especially if you've been raised in this way where you sort of have this sort of model minority ethos going on in your head. But they are problems, and there are racist things that are happening, and you do need to speak about them. It's just that, how do you speak about them? How do you take them seriously enough so that you just don't brush them off as just like so-called minor feelings or something that's not as important as the problems other people are dealing with, while at the same time still recognizing the privilege that you may just unwittingly be occupying, because there are the ways you see yourself, but then there are also the ways that other people see you. So, I mean, I can be crying about all the problems that Asian American men have being represented in Hollywood, but most people I talk to about that, they have no idea what I'm talking about. It's like literally the first time this problem has occurred to them. And that just blows my mind. So, I will talk to some people and they don't think I have any problems at all. And then, part of me really gets mad about that. But then another part of me, when I step back and say, yeah, I don't really have any problems. Like, I'm comfortable. I have a job. I'm eating, I'm happily married. I mean, all these things are really good. So it is a really weird thing to negotiate. And what part of that, and I feel like in some ways that tension I feel like that kind of defines Asian Americanness in a way, at least for me, and I think probably for a lot of people. Because just speaking to other Asian Americans or Asians, or Asians that are living in America, that sort of strange in between tension is, I think, a peculiar facet of our particular POC experience that is maybe not quite the same for other groups.
Great. Does anyone else have any questions? We're running low on time, so if you want to ask, now is your chance. I guess I also have like a quick question. I think something I'm thinking about is, I guess I wondered, I put this in like the prompted questions we sent you, which is like what you're reading right now, or I guess a better question is if there's like any particular poems or like pieces that have been on your mind recently. I've noticed that like there's this Turkish poet whose name I'm forgetting, but has this poem called On Living that I've seen like circulating around a lot, and wondering if you've like been running into poems a lot recently or specific writers a lot recently.
It's funny you mentioned that poem. Did you not know that this is a poem that we taught? This is the book right here by Nazim Hikmet. We taught that poem at the last Brooklyn Poets Yop, which was a workshop and open mic. And one of my former teachers, Edward Hirsch, taught a workshop on that particular poem. That's definitely a poem that resonates with me. It's one of the first poems that I remembered, I think, when everything started. Was thinking about, poems will just occur to you as being able to help. And what's great about that poem is it doesn't sugarcoat anything. It's not a Coldplay message. So if you don't know that poem, I highly recommend it. Just Google Hikmet On Living. I don't know if you can see these stacks of books. I have a lot of books right now. I'm reading this book right now by Arya Abu. This book by Rick Barrett is great, called The Galleons. He's a Filipino-American poet. This is his fourth book. It's fantastic. Probably my favorite poetry book of the year so far. I wrote a little review of the last poem in this book, which I feel like really speaks to the moment, even though it was not written about the pandemic. But it's a strange way that poems work. If they're truly timeless, they will sometimes come on to take more resonance when certain things happen in the world. So I recommend that book. You can probably read it in one sitting. I'm working on my next book project. Is this? I kind of referred to this in passing earlier when I was answering one of the other questions. I'm going to be working on a book of essays about Asian American masculinity. So I've been reading a lot of books on that front, not just by men, of course, but books of scholarship, memoirs. This whole stack here. This is what I'm reading right now. It's very heavy. It's very good. Book of scholarship, not a great cover, but it's called Writing Manhood in Black and Yellow by Daniel Y. Kim, brilliant scholar. Souls of Blackfoot, of course, just reference point. This is a book I haven't read by a Yale professor. It was caused a big controversy a few years back, so I'm kind of curious to see what the book is actually like, called Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. These are books all I read recently. I don't know if you have this book by Alex Tizon called Big Little Man. This is a great book about the problems besetting Asian American heterosexual men. Unfortunately, he died a few years back. This book that came out a couple years ago by Wesley Yang, The Souls of Yellow Folk. Not sure why it's titled that. I know why it's titled that, but I don't think it's a great title. But he's a brilliant essayist about race, but about other things as well. This book by Alexander Chee, I just adore. How to Write an Autobiographical Novel. If you don't know Alex Chee, you should. It's a fiction writer, but it's a book of essays, not just about fiction writing, but about politics and identity. And it's just a beautiful writer. This book by Eddie Wong fucked me up. I didn't realize how good a writer he is. Fresh Off the Boat. I don't watch that show, but this book is. What's interesting about this book is there's a book on digital cassette. And he reads the audiobook, and I'm trying to remember he recorded the audiobook, I think during, was it Hurricane Sandy, when everything was flooded and shut down in New York City, maybe like 8 years ago. So he went in the studio, recorded the whole thing. So it's really the way to experience that book, is just listening to him read it, because his voice is so memorable and charismatic. So that's just some of the stuff I'm reading right now. But there's more. I'm going to stop there. I see another question.
Yeah, I think there's one more. The question is, are there days when you can't think right at all, and what do you do then?
Oh, that's a great question. Wish people would ask that question in every Q&A. Are there days when I can't think or write at all? Of course, yes. There are many days like that. What do I do with them? That's a really good question. I just exist. I just manage to move through the day. So that's sort of my comical answer, but I think that, I guess what I'm maybe hearing in that question is like, what do you do, I guess, from a productivity standpoint, or should you be worried when you can't think or write? Hopefully this is what you're driving at, but I personally don't think you should. I mean, I know when I was younger, I would freak out. I mentioned like the days after 9/11 being really worried. And that was the time when I felt like if I wasn't writing poems, there would be times when I would worry if I would ever be able to do it again. And that's not because you're blocked or because you don't have any inspiration or because you're not talented or any of those things. It's just because you haven't practiced enough. That's what a lot of young writers don't understand about writing. Writing is a practice just like everything else, just like meditation is a practice, just like working out is a practice, yoga is a practice, gardening, cooking. Like, you're not good at any of those things right away. And writing is something that, it doesn't reward talent the way that maybe like a natural physical thing would, like say like you're just naturally physically gifted and good at football or something. Writing, especially poetry, takes years. And I feel like what's interesting about poetry is you can peak early. Like, I've taught long enough to know that anyone can write a good poem. And I don't say that facetiously, like anyone, like third graders, second graders, on college students, high school students, senior citizens, like people that have never read or written poetry before. They come into the Brooklyn Poets Yop and they'll just knock out a poem in 10 minutes. And sometimes they're just fucking amazing. And I remember that early experience of writing poems for the first time and being like transformed by it. Like the first time I thought I wrote something really good. And then you freak out because it can be really hard to get that feeling back. And when you don't get it back, you feel like something is wrong with you. You feel like you're blocked, or maybe you're not talented enough, or maybe you haven't read enough, maybe you haven't gone to school enough for it, but you just don't have enough repetitions. So I would say the repetitions of not doing anything, not being able to think and write at all, are just as important as the repetitions of doing. This is maybe my meditation practice talking now. So one of the things I've been doing in the pandemic is meditating more. My mom will be happy to hear this. My mom and my dad are now both on the call because they're both Buddhists. But I've been meditating now for 18 days straight using Insight Timer. I can track that shit with the app. But one of the things I've loved in this current sort of series of meditation talks I've been listening to is how the teacher is talking about, you know, when your mind wanders or when you have thoughts, you can't be panicking about that or afraid of that, because those are actually necessary, right? Like that's your practice, right? So every time your mind wanders, you shouldn't feel like you're screwing up or not doing it right. That's actually your opportunity to bring your mind sort of back, or sort of like to come back to your breath, or to return from that wandering. So I would say, like, sitting there not doing anything, even for hours, I would actually encourage it. Like, try to get as many reps of doing kind of nothing at your desk for like 6 to 10 hours. And you're going to need to do that a lot to become a writer, because even just reading is a kind of not doing, of course. I mean, at least when you're writing, you feel like you're creating something. But when you're reading, it feels, even if you're actively reading, it feels more passive. And to read long, complicated books, you need many hours of sitting on your ass. And that can feel like you're not doing anything, especially when like there's a pandemic going on. So you just have to remind yourself that all of that seemingly not doing is just as important to the writing practice as the actual moments when you're putting words to paper, or, you know, typing words on the screen.
Thank you for sharing that advice. So our time is ending, and we'd like to thank everyone for attending our last webinar of the year. And congratulations to any seniors in the chat, because it's the last day of exams. Thank you so much to Jason for speaking about your work and answering all our questions. It's been an honor to have you as our guest. And I'll send everyone who signed up via Eventbrite a link to a recording of this, and maybe any book suggestions by Jason too. Yeah. And I hope everyone stays safe.
Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.